Hello and welcome to this week's live weekly warm-up. This is the second in our three-part series of sort of what not to do in your warm-up. This one is going to be pretty fun because it's what not to do. So I'm going to get to make all the mistakes, and it's intentional mistake making, which sometimes can be a great learning experience. So today I'm going to be doing a technique exercise, and I am going to do it how a lot of students may do it, which is kind of incorrect and not as efficient and effective as it possibly could be. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to start by demonstrating it and then talk through where the opportunity for improvement is. And if you notice anything that you think I'm doing wrong, then leave a comment with that to see, sort of test your knowledge of how well you know what a technique exercise really is about. So let me go ahead and play through this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a scale in thirds, because of course that's a technique exercise, and I'm going to do it in the key of D flat major. All right, so what did you notice were the mistakes? There were a lot of mistakes, some more intentional than others, but that's part of the point. So the first mistake, which is not a super obvious one, but I think the first big mistake is that I was doing an exercise that was probably too hard for me. This is really common where students will do the chromatic scale as their technique warm-up or a scale in thirds, but in too hard of a key. That's not to say that you should never use D flat major as your warm-up. It's actually a really good idea to do some of the harder keys in your warm-ups, but it's not a true technique warm-up exercise if you're uncomfortable and unfamiliar with the notes. So that's a really important distinction. And this actually goes for all of the warm-ups, long tones, technique, and articulation. If you're having to spend a majority of your effort focusing on playing the right notes and getting the right fingerings, then you're not actually developing your clarinet technique. You're learning the notes of the music, and it's great, and it's really important to learn the notes of these harder scales. It's really good for you, but you're not doing an actual technique exercise until you can dedicate a majority of your attention to actually the technique of moving your fingers and how you sound and things like that. So that's the first not so obvious mistake. The second, also maybe even more important mistake or more obvious mistake, is the rhythm. I wasn't steady with the rhythm at all. I had hesitations and pauses at the top and at the bottom. It was sort of like I was getting lost and wasn't sure where I was going. And tied into that mistake, part of the reason why those rhythmic mistakes were there is because I was going too fast. And that is a totally common mistake where people will play their scales and they have an idea of like, oh, scales should be fast and energetic like that, because that's how you imagine the professionals practice them. But the mistake is going too fast and not being able to be steady with the rhythm. If you're not perfectly metronomically steady, then you're not getting as much as you could out of the exercise. So being more steady, rhythmically steady, and just going slower so that can be an option is really important. Now, the other thing, too, that was probably less obvious, you may have noticed that I was tonguing every single note. And I personally am not at all a fan of articulating technique exercises. Articulating scales is good, and it's good to practice your scales articulated. But at that point, it becomes more of an articulation exercise because you're focusing on tonguing, lining up your fingers and your tongue. Maybe it's a little bit of a hybrid technique and articulation, but once you get the tonguing involved, then it adds on another layer of things to think about, and you can't dedicate your full attention to just where your fingers are going and how your fingers are going. So I really am a big fan of always slurring the technique exercises, all technique exercises. And the other benefit of slurring is that it really forces you to be really clean with your fingers. If I tongue, if you can see my fingers, I'll just do the first interval. And if I tongue it, I can get away with a lot. You can see my fingers are really sloppy. If I were to slur that and move my fingers the same way, you can hear all kinds of extra junk in between those notes, and we don't want that. We want it to be really clean, and the point of the technique exercise is to work on coordinating your fingers and moving them really well in time. So if you're slurring, then you can actually hear if it's good. Versus, and that's what we want, is that perfectly clean connection, really well coordinated movement between every single note that you're playing. And that's pretty much all of the big mistakes that I made. If you noticed another mistake, leave it in the comments. I would love to hear these different ideas and clarify what it means to do a technique exercise really well. And just to recap, what it actually means to do it well is that you can focus a lot of your attention on how your fingers are moving. You can work on playing with a great sound, playing with clean connections, slurring between the notes, going at a speed where you can go perfectly rhythmically precise, and of course not doing anything that's too hard for you. If you're having to focus on the notes, then you're not focusing on the technique. So let me do a good version of this, and I'll go ahead and do it in C major to just make it an easier key, and then show you how to do it at a nice comfortable tempo, be really precise, and slur and all that good stuff. So this is the proper way to do a technique exercise now. And actually, to really make it proper, I hated how the evenness of the sound from like the throat tones up to the high notes, like the B didn't come out matching, the throat tones were all over the place. So I'll do that bit again to make it better and really get a lot out of this exercise. There's a little squeak at the end, so I'll fix that. And that was a nice finish and nice sounds and a nice way to do a technique exercise. So I hope that you found this helpful. It's sometimes really beneficial to see the wrong ways of doing things. Also comment below if there's any of these things that you're guilty of. I think tonguing technique exercises is a really, really common one. And I think doing things that are a little bit too hard so that you're not able to focus on the rhythm is another big one. So excuse me. Thanks so much for watching this week's live weekly warm-up. Next week, we'll be talking about how to do articulation exercises incorrectly, or how to get the most out of articulation exercises. So that'll be a lot of fun too if you enjoyed this one. Of course, you can also go back and watch last week's of the long tones and how to get the most out of long tones. But thank you so much for watching this, and I'll see you next week in the next live weekly warm-up.